Hi everyone, welcome to the Obsidian video channel. My name is Sudha Srinivasan. I'm the VP of Marketing at Obsidian. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the Fireside chat today. Wendy Whitmore is the VP of IBM X-Force Threat Intelligence. Wendy has over 15 years of experience in incident response, proactive and strategic information security services, intelligence, and data breach investigations. Wendy is a global voice in cybersecurity and threat intelligence. Welcome, Wendy. Ben
Thank you.
Johnson,
Excited to be here today.
great to have you. Ben Johnson is the co-founder and CTO of Obsidian Security. Before Obsidian, Ben co-founded Carbon Black and most recently served as the company's chief security strategist. Ben was an NSA computer scientist and later worked as a cyber engineer in an advanced intrusion operations division for the intelligence community. Ben is active in the cyber community where he's a technical advisor to the US FISA court and sits on the boards of multiple security startups. Ben, welcome. The topic
Thanks.
of today's conversation is the impact that the COVID crisis has had on the cybersecurity landscape. We will also hear about how cyber leaders are thinking ahead beyond the immediate crisis. I think a lot of the focus so far has been on what do we do and how do we get ready. But today we're going to talk about how cyber leaders are looking ahead beyond this immediate crisis at new risks and opportunities. A couple of quick notes before we start. Attendees' lines are muted when you join, so please post any questions you have in the chat window and Ben and Wendy will take them up during the session. This session is also being recorded. We will share the recording after the call. With that, Ben and Wendy, over to you.
Thanks, Sudha. And yeah, we're trying to, I think we're trying to keep this a little light. We're both in California, so it's only 10 in the morning. So, when Wendy and I usually hang out, it's often over margaritas, talking shop, talking surfing, that kind of thing. But we thought 10 a.m. might be a little early to start drinking when we both have full days ahead of us, lots of other meetings and such. But Wendy, thanks for joining. Really excited to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the invite, Ben. I'm excited. This is a little different than some of the conversations I normally have, so I'm excited about that.
Yeah, if you haven't seen, Wendy's kind of all over the news and doing all sorts of other appearances and that kind of thing. So we're trying to keep this a little less formal, as you can probably tell already. We gave you some nice music to start and that kind of thing. But so Sudha introduced me. I'm the CTO of Obsidian. I spend a lot of time thinking about innovation and that kind of thing, but really in the area of cybersecurity and specifically cloud threats and detection and response and that kind of thing. We can talk about more of that later. But Wendy, Sudha introduced you, but tell us your story. Like how'd you get here?
Yeah, well, I don't want to take too much time. So I think, quick and dirty. So I studied computer science in college. And I attended college on an Air Force ROTC scholarship, though. And so I had the opportunity to go into the Air Force after. And I got a really cool opportunity, which was to join as a special agent doing computer crime investigations for Air Force OSI. So that really that was my dream job. That was an opportunity to do some really cool stuff and carry a gun to work every day. And, I loved it. And so after I got out of the Air Force, I joined the private sector, joined a company that was really small at the time called Mandiant. I joined there as about the 30th employee. So, I loved kind of just a small company vibe, but just very passionate about cybersecurity and in particular intrusion and breach response. And I stayed at Mandiant for quite some time. I then had the opportunity to join another really small company called CrowdStrike and moved over there and started their services team. So really their consulting operations and had a fantastic time there, learned a ton. Really got jazzed about the technology that we were building. And obviously you see, the CrowdStrike technology kind of being everywhere today. And then just about 4 years ago, I had the opportunity to join IBM and to really grow out not only their incident response practice globally, but then also their threat intelligence teams, right? And look to build that at the scale of IBM, right? Which is huge, is one of the largest companies in the world with over 400,000 employees. And so a big challenge there for, how do we look to kind of tackle this level of scale? And that was something that I was really excited about. And then certainly to get to work with a lot of partners across the board, right, in a much wider range outside of just incident response or threat intelligence, but really across the whole scope of security. So that's where we're at today.
I've never heard of any of those companies. No, that's phenomenal. Air Force, Mandiant, CrowdStrike, IBM. That's quite a resume, quite a roster you get there. So you just briefly talked
Everyone
about.
gets lucky sometimes, right?
Sounds like a few times in a row. And you know, you just started talking a little bit about, you know, kind of what led you to IBM and that kind of thing. But can you tell me more about what your team does? I know at least before this you were flying around the world and stuff, but what all do you do?
Yeah, you know, the easiest way to capture it, I think, is to say anything and everything you can think of that helps an organization detect an attack, prepare to respond to it, or to respond to it. That's probably something that our team does, right? So we really focus, bread and butter is always going to be incident response investigations or data breach investigations, right? So have a major incident, you call in a team of people, they fly in on site typically, and you know, respond to the attack. And then we have the back-end teams that are then responsible for the threat intelligence. So the analytics, the researchers, people are doing reverse engineering. We have some pretty hardcore technical skills on that team. We also have people who specialize in regions of the world or types of attackers. And then we also have a state-of-the-art facility in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as well as within Europe. And we've got one opening, was scheduled to open already, right, in India, but most likely being pushed out to Q4 of this year. So facilities where we do simulation training in how to respond to breaches. And that's really full scope. So we're not looking at just how do you do the technical analysis, but it's how do you communicate to the press if needed? What do you say to your employees? You know, how much insight do you give them? Do they know if they're supposed to talk to the press outside or are they not, right? How do you work with legal teams, operations? And so it's really this interdisciplinary approach to responding to breaches that we found clients be extremely successful at practicing in kind of a live fire environment and then taking that, you know, back to their office. So as you might imagine, some of that has changed, right? We are now doing a lot of that virtually. So we've got still very similar type of simulation environments, but now offering a lot of that training virtually and remotely so that organizations can continue to practice despite not being able to join us in the office right now.
Wow. Well, that's a lot that you're all are doing. Do you get to ride in that truck? I've seen that truck that you have that goes around.
Yeah, the truck is in Europe. It is not driving around right now. We were extremely busy with it right prior to COVID, and we've got plans to get back online with that team in Q3. So right now that team also offering virtual training, but yeah, I was scheduled to actually be in Italy right about now. And unfortunately, that's not the case. So looking forward to getting back online with that truck.
Oh, I hear you. So, okay, so your team is doing basically all things sort of cyber defense, it sounds like, you know, training, response, threat intel, proactive services, you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, I think one of the things I'm really excited to hear about is kind of what have you been seeing? Like what's been going on the last few months from attacks or, you know, risk or that kind of thing. Like when I say, what have you been seeing? Like maybe kind of what comes to mind and what can you tell us?
Yeah, you know, it's been an interesting time, right, to be in cybersecurity. So from the criminal perspective, like if you are a cyber attacker, whether you're working for like an organized crime group or you're working for a nation state, I think the reality is it's just an environment with a tremendous amount of opportunity right now, right? Attackers love to take advantage of chaos. And a lot of times when we see chaos, it's at more of a regional scale, right? Maybe there's a natural disaster in a certain part of the world and it creates chaos and scams can erupt from that. And then many of the scams take on, you know, cyber nature or flavor these days. Well, now you've got a global environment where you've got a crisis throughout the world and it's impacting literally every human being, right? From the perspective of perhaps you're not as concerned for yourself, but you may very well be concerned for loved ones that are nearby. And so from that perspective, people are reading the news much more. They're expecting different types of emails in their email inbox. They're checking social media more. And it's everything from, you know, wanting to know about how you might contract the virus to, you know, when is my favorite store going to open again locally? So there's this just wide kind of swath of information all floating around. And if you think about it, it's just an opportunity and an environment ripe for attackers. So some things that we're seeing are, one, a significant amount of increase in the breaches we're responding to. In some regions, it's over 125% increase in the number of attacks we're responding to relative to the same time last year. In terms of spam, we've seen a 6,000% increase just in March and April alone of spam. And what we're seeing, one of the kind of interesting things is that the spam can kind of, and spam and attacker activity in general, right? So at IBM, we have some pretty wide scale ability to track like DNS requests, for example, to track spam campaigns, in addition to just the breaches, right? And the work that the incident response team is doing. So what we've seen there that's kind of interesting is that as countries and regions of the world were impacted more physically, meaning they were at the height of their number of infections and the response to those infections, attacks from those same geographical regions went down, which, you know, makes a lot of common sense, but it's something that we don't always have the ability to track effectively, right? So really getting to see that, like, okay, as China is dealing with, you know, the epicenter of the actual global pandemic at that time and the heightened number of infections, then attackers are a little more quiet, right? They're not doing as much activity. But then as their, you know, country kind of goes back to business as usual, the same thing happens with the attacks, right? We start seeing those attacks increase and ramp up again. And that's been a really interesting thing to track based on different regions of the world. And then we've also seen that it's really not just cyber criminals, right? The cyber criminals are certainly the ones that are propagating a lot of the spam campaigns. But in terms of malware campaigns and then new malware coming out and online, we're seeing nation state actors get behind that, where they're leveraging the, in particular, the actual crisis in order to kind of wrap malware around that, right? So build a new piece of malware or a variant of an existing piece of malware, but have it potentially, you know, be themed around the attack. And that's, again, for them, just another way to get into an environment that they may be interested in, and that could potentially give them a foothold into one.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And you basically mentioned that when countries were sort of at their peak, then maybe attacks from those areas were lower. Maybe they were more of the target of the campaigns. But then as I think as you know, some of the countries have gotten at least a little bit closer to normal. Not sure we'll ever be at normal again, but you know, maybe the attacks are starting to pick up again. So do you have any more thoughts around that, or you know, was it just people were kind of actually focused on themselves and their health, and so they weren't being criminals, or do you have any other ideas around why they sort of stopped, you know, launching attacks during that time?
Yes, and I would want to say, I want to be careful to say they stopped launching attacks. What we saw was just a decrease, right, in the overall number, so not a complete stop altogether. And I guess what we're seeing now in terms of the attacks moving forward is really what we were anticipating was probably going to be a lot of ransomware attacks, which is something we've seen, right, for years now, but they've continued to grow, they've continued to get higher numbers, and to produce higher numbers and be much more coordinated. And we're certainly seeing that, right? So attackers who are pretty almost surgical, right, about the types of data that they're going after, and then understanding the value of that data when they do get it, when they do access it and encrypt it, and asking for ransoms that are astronomically high, right, in the tens of millions of dollars for that information to be taken back. So we're seeing that really hit a wide variety of industries, which is what we expected. One of the things that I think we're really concerned about is that, are we going to see ransomware events hit hospitals, medical insurers, and critical infrastructure like financial services and, you know, water and power? Those are things that, on top of everything else that's going on, if those type of services were taken offline by a cyber attack, then we're talking about a really monumental impact. So those are the types of things that we're really concerned about. We've seen them to a small degree so far, right? A smaller degree in the sense that while the attacks are, I think, going on more than ever and as prevalent as ever, we're also seeing on the flip side, and really positively, right, organizations are actually better prepared than ever. They're still not as prepared as we'd like everyone to be, right? But in terms of kind of our ability to withstand and sustain those types of attacks, we see organizations continue to get better and better, which is great news.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's a key point. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. I saw some news that some attackers, I think it was probably ransomware, when they realized that they had hit some, I think it was like a hospital or something, they basically apologized and didn't charge the ransom. Have you seen anything like that where they actually have a heart and they, they're trying to make their money or whatever, but they're also understanding of the times, or is it just, no, they don't care, they want their money?
Yeah, we haven't personally investigated anything where, the ransomware attackers had a change of heart. That's good to hear. I know early on we were hearing stories about, hey, the attackers are going to purposely avoid waging attacks towards hospitals and healthcare systems. And I deal with that, I guess, I read that with a lot of skepticism, right? I take it with a grain of salt of, okay, well, maybe one group isn't going to, but that maybe opens the door for other groups. So I think the point there is just make sure that organizations are not letting their guard down, and that realizing that now more than ever, a lot of these steps we talk about taking proactively are important to take continuously.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Well, so you just mentioned something interesting, that you felt teams are actually quite well equipped, or at least better prepared for some of these attacks and things. So as we start to, and I know the theme of this is kind of starting to emerge out of at least hopefully the worst of it, and start to look at the longer haul, or what's the new normal. Are you all starting to see sort of different security strategy, or kind of what changes are you starting to see as you talk to companies about their security strategy or their posture or that kind of thing? Like how are people thinking about this?
Yeah, I think the realization has kind of hit now that this isn't necessarily something that this being the need to work from home, right? And to have employees that are working remotely. I don't think that's a short-term situation, right? And more organizations are realizing that. I think many organizations were set up to work that way already. Like if you look at in the cybersecurity space in particular, right? I think your organization is an example, right? Where you have offices, but you also have remote employees who access data. What we've seen is that for some of our organizations, that was simply for the executive management who is traveling globally that needed to access data and files and applications in that type of remote way. And now it's really the whole workforce. So that has shifted a fair amount. I think the need for the cloud and the importance of it and to have that infrastructure has never been more important than it is now. And so for organizations to make sure that as they, if they're in the middle of a shift or a transition, or if they're simply hardening their existing setups, that they've really got to start looking at, ensuring that they have the most secure setups possible for accessing remote information, for ensuring that their cloud systems are protected, that they can sustain the workload now that's increased, right, from the level of maybe transactions or access to the data, and then certainly that their network infrastructure is set up so that it can support it as well. And I have to say, I'm really curious your perspective, right, on what types of things you've seen different. Are more companies, are you seeing more companies be more open to newer types of cloud technology? Are you breaking down, or do you feel like some of the barriers are being broken down for those discussions where that's not even really a question and maybe it's a different part of the dialogue at this point?
Yeah. So I think most organizations were already on their kind of cloud journey, whatever you want to call it, cloud transformation, digital transformation, whatever. And a lot of organizations over the last few years have said we're a cloud first or cloud forward, basically meaning like maybe not everything overnight is shifting to cloud, but any new project has to look at SaaS or IaaS or whatever. And I think what this did was just a unbelievable acceleration of, okay, yes, this is really important for business continuity and access and, that kind of thing. And one of the quotes I heard from a friend was that we, sort of the collective we, are creating the same problem in the cloud in 10 days that it took 10 years to create on-prem, which is just like giving access to everybody and plugging things in and signing up for stuff. And, we all know how easy it is to sign up for SaaS. You might not even need a credit card and your data is already,
Yeah.
on someone else's cloud. And so, yeah, we're seeing that. And I think what the recent, events have forced is that things like Zoom or Box or even Office 365, they might have been really core applications for the business, but now like the exec team and the board and everyone is really kind of waking up and saying, holy crap, this is a very, sort of first class citizen in terms of our business, like this, Zoom, or as an example, and
Right.
we need to actually have some security and monitoring and like what the heck's going on. And this was just sort of brought in through the side door, and our employees all started using something, and now we need to make it again much more of like sort of enterprise grade, stability, security, availability, all the other stuff. So yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot there. And I can talk more, but I think still there's that question of expertise. Like people aren't quite sure what they should be concerned with when it comes to cloud security controls, threats, usage, what's acceptable, what's not, what's, kind of what's acceptable risk. So I guess I'll throw it back on you, and I just talked way too much. What's are you, when you go in and talk to a company and, maybe virtually go in now, and are advising them or helping them recover from a potential incident or whatever, do you feel like there's a lack of expertise, or kind of where is the maturity from like a cloud security perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to focus not so much on just the cloud security piece, but as we look at like just how does your business operate, we're talking about how do employees access information, right? The data needed to do their job. So that's systems, that's applications, that's data that is located somewhere, right? Be it in the cloud or be it in an on-premise component of your organization that now has to be accessed remotely, right? So I think the biggest thing is looking at then how can we secure authentication to it. For many organizations, they're behind in multi-factor authentication for remote devices. Not all, but many. And that can relate certainly to data that's in the cloud. It can also relate to different applications that are needed maybe for a manufacturing component of your organization. Wherever that may be, it's really critical now more than ever that your employees need legitimate access to that information or that ability to deliver some sort of solution. And if you don't have it secured, then attackers are going to find that and gain access to it. So one of the biggest things we've been really talking about is looking just at two-factor and multi-factor authentication towards remote devices. As part of that, then we kind of hit on endpoints earlier. The network perimeter has essentially disappeared, right? Because your employees are now everywhere, and it's not just your executive, that needs to access a piece of data from a Wi-Fi connection on an airplane, but it's now, your entire remote workforce. And so from that perspective, really looking at organizations who maybe previously looked at defending the network perimeter more and prioritizing that much higher in the stack versus having insight into the endpoints or insight into applications, right? And who's logging into these applications? What kind of access controls do we have? How are they being used? Is the behavioral detection component of that something that I can trust? So, that's something that IBM, has made a huge transformation on, right? I mentioned earlier, for over 400,000 employees, at any one time, we could have between 600,000 to 1 million nodes on our environment. And I think the stats are something about, I think the largest number of concurrent VPN connections we have tracked thus far, I think was around the neighborhood of 350,000 connections at any one time. So you think about the load and that capacity on the network, we really have to drive detections and the ability to look for bad things to the endpoints and to the application layers so that we can really track, with pinpoint accuracy, what's good, what's not so good, and then ultimately what's malicious.
Yeah. Well, you certainly have a lot of background across all those areas. So application, endpoint, that kind of thing. Um, I want to take a pause because I think if you were with us for the first few minutes, everyone listening, we said we do a lot of like formal stuff. Wendy's on TV a lot. I do my fair share of flying around the world, or at least I was. Um, so we want to talk sneakers for a second. Everyone on the call is probably like, "What the hell are you guys talking about?" But we're both kind of sneaker heads, so maybe so I don't embarrass Wendy, I'll start. But we always kind of are wearing different, Jordans or Converse or whatever. But I have all sorts of different sneakers that I'll share. But we're all going a little stir crazy. So, I got to like my Jordans here, and possibly also in honor of The Last Dance. If anyone's been watching that lately, it's a great documentary. But Wendy, why don't you share us something you got over there?
All right. I'm just taking a note actually that I still need to watch that. I think I've got my weekend plans. All right. So you started with Jordans. I'll start with some Jordans too. These ones I feel like pretty cool with like the little hot pink kick to them, but very like, business in the front type of situation going on.
Awesome. I'm going to have to get some hot pink ones myself. And then the second one I'll show is, unfortunately, the launch got scrubbed yesterday, but sort of in honor of NASA, I had the NASA 50th anniversary shoe. It's kind of like a moon boot. And it basically has a dad joke on it, which my kids would say I'm very good at dad jokes that are horrible. It says, "Don't tell me the sky's the limit when there are footprints on the moon." So it's kind of a little motivation, right? But
Very
yeah,
cool.
nice little silver.
So I appreciate that because I worked at NASA actually for 2 years. They were one of a big client of an organization I worked at, and so definitely love the moon boots. I might have to copy you on that one. My next one is an all-weather ode to California, the original like Vans skateboard shoe, the high top. Again, a little pink with the business here, but these ones are like lined for basically trekking across mountains, I'm pretty sure. So I usually use those as one of my favorite winter high tops.
Yeah, you could skateboard in Manhattan Beach or Santa Monica or whatever, and then go to Mammoth all in the same day, right?
Exactly.
And then the last one, and then we'll kind of get back to regularly scheduled programming, is for Obsidian. We wanted to sort of all have the same thing at Black Hat. I think it was 2 years ago, maybe. So we got basically, similar to our color here, we got some Nikes in that thing, and you could actually see these from across the casino, right? Because they're kind of bright. So I think
Did you guys have those custom made?
No, I think we just found them. We randomly searched enough, and someone else had made them. Maybe it's like North Carolina fans or something. I don't know, but sort of that blue there. So yeah,
those look like some original ones that MJ would have been wearing.
I know.
Right?
Yeah.
When he was a Tar Heel. All right, so my last ones are also kind of old school. Got to go with the Chuck Taylors, but these ones are kind of fancy. So you mentioned like you get the luxury of wearing tennis shoes. I often am in high heels when I'm working. We won't get into all the reasons why, right? Gender roles, all that kind of fun stuff. But I love high heels, but I also love these fancy sneakers. And so these have like a python print, and then really to kick it up a notch, a leopard stripe and leopard and star. So I found those when I was traveling last year. Seems like, again, an eternity ago, but I always kind of look for cool tennis shoes when I'm traveling to see if I can find something unique that's a little different than what I can get at home.
Yeah. Speaking of traveling, so first of all, those are really cool too. I think I've focused mostly on Nikes, so I'm glad you brought in some other brand representation there. And by the way, the book Shoe Dog by the Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, is incredible too. I'm always up for good book recommendations, so I'll throw it out there because hopefully everyone else is too. But speaking of travel, before we go back to cyber, I think we're all wondering about that photo behind you of the lion with blood or whatever. Tell us about that.
Talk about a pretty cool life experience. So, as some of you know, so I went first time on safari a couple years ago, and I was so excited and passionate about it that I've gone back now a couple more times. And that was actually on my first trip, and it was that lion. Our guides estimated that he was maybe between 2 or 3 years old, so still fairly young, more of a like a teenager, if you will. And it was he and his sister, and it was during a massive drought. They had taken down a huge buffalo, and I won't get into the detail, but that was a pretty gory scene for some time. Unfortunately, you know, they didn't completely kill the buffalo before they started eating it, so that was pretty rough. But the result of it was a really interesting picture where the lion was eating and then looked up and literally looked straight into my camera lens and just had blood, dripping off his whiskers and his mane. And I got a few shots, and I thought that was the best one out of them. And so now I've got it hanging in my house.
It's awesome. It's like a National Geographic cover.
Well, thank you. Yeah, not quite. Still very amateur, but I love it. And it definitely was a special moment in time for me, and kind of reminds you too, like, when I came back from that experience, I think we can all get so caught up, right, in our jobs and the politics behind them and the need to get things done. And you can get frustrated that something's not happening fast enough. But I actually had a moment where I kind of sat back and said, when I'm sitting around the conference table and we're debating over some hot topic, I'm actually not worried that one of my coworkers is going to like murder me at that conference table or start eating me. So I actually have it much better off than the lion who's fighting for his life every minute of every day. So, it kind of gave me a very different perspective coming back, actually.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, thanks, and thanks for sharing that story. That's incredible. All right, everyone on the call is probably like, all right, what the hell are we talking about here? Hopefully you'll walk away and remember this really cool lion story, or some sneakers, or whatever. But going back to, sort of looking forward, and, we're seeing a lot of, not new, some of it's new, but a lot of continued adoption or acceleration into, Office 365 or Zoom or some of these other things. What do you see when you're out there doing, maybe it's IR after a breach, or you're looking at it, like, are teams doing all right with these tools? Have they forgotten to enable, like audit logging, or are they, not sort of monitoring them enough for, sort of insider threats? Or can you just talk a little bit, and maybe we can get to some details after that, but a little bit about like kind of what you're seeing with some of those kinds of tools?
Yes. So, first and foremost, we're seeing a ton of breaches related to, data being in the cloud. But I want to be careful and say, I'm not saying that the cloud is causing any of that, right? I think that we've got to, one of the concerns, right, I have about the cloud, and I don't have a concern about, should we or shouldn't we, right? That discussion has passed. It makes a ton of sense, right? For the most part, it's more economically feasible. We can increase performance. There's all these benefits that are fantastic to the cloud. The concern I have is when organizations will say, well, my data is in the cloud, so I don't have to worry about that, right? As if now it's someone else's problem, and or it's only the problem of the organization who, is hosting it. And while I think many organizations who do host data in the cloud do a fantastic job of protecting it, and you can look at any number of providers that have got a tremendous amount of just default settings available to enable additional logging and auditing and understanding who's accessing and then locking that down. So there's a lot of benefit there. But when we typically see problems, it's related to kind of a miscommunication and a difference in expectations between the data provider and that organization that may be now hosting it. So from that sense, I think it's really important to realize that security is still everybody's, it's in everyone's purview, right? And it's everyone's responsibility. In terms of actual cloud breaches, 65% of them are due to common misconfigurations. So from that perspective, you can say, okay, there's clearly kind of a gap in maybe default settings were enabled, they weren't changed over, whether it was by the owner or the organization that was hosting it. And those types of communications, I think, really need to improve. But the reality is that as all data moves to more efficient mechanisms, then we're going to see more breaches move to those type of locations as well. And for us, and I think for most response teams, we don't really look at it differently, right? I don't say, oh, this breach is different because it's in the cloud. At the end of the day, you're still looking at data, right? It all gets down to the data. What was accessed, what was stolen, who and by whom, right? Whom accessed it and when? Did they move it somewhere else that we need to be aware of? And so from that perspective, we don't approach those types of attacks differently, other than wanting to understand all of the different data sources and kind of attributes that we might have access to because of where the data is hosted that might be different if it's on-prem. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of really positives about how we can get access to the data. But I think that just the bottom line is that as so much more volumes of data move towards being hosted in the cloud, many more breaches are going to move towards that. And, attackers are going to continually stay abreast of every, type of change and every type of benefit, right? If AWS changes a setting that makes it a little bit easier, that by tweaking one thing, that it's easier to get data from a particular type of organization, then attackers are going to figure that out. So we all need to be, extra diligent in that regard.
Yeah. I don't know what to say other than that was a lot of good information. I will add to your, I think one of your earlier points there around the shared responsibility model and not quite sure who's responsible for what. I think we're getting slightly more awareness that it's not just up to, Microsoft or Zoom or Workday or whomever, or, IBM or whoever's providing the cloud service, that there is a responsibility on your team, your business. But one of the things that was actually a little bit more surprising to me, and maybe it shouldn't have been, maybe it's my fault, but I was pretty surprised how disconnected the teams are inside the organization between the application owner, like the admin of Salesforce or Office or AWS or whatever, and the security team. So it's not just the disconnect between maybe the service provider and the org. Within the org, there's often a lot of, sort of ownership contention, politics, disconnect. Maybe everyone's super friendly, but there's still, miscommunication. So I just want to throw that out there that, what we see a lot too is like the security team has to go beg the Office 365 admin for like logs because they're trying to do an investigation to an employee or, potential breach or that kind of thing. So there's a lot of challenges here, but to your point too, there's a lot of, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think the level of insight you have into understanding, right, that because all of the different applications that your technology is going to be leveraging, right, you really see how those are implemented in different organizations and the pros and cons. So I would imagine you've got a best practice list for sure, right, in terms of how parts of the organization can work together. You mentioned earlier I do a fair amount of speaking, and actually the most of the speaking I do is just speaking to our clients, right? And a lot of times we'll go to executive offsite events where it's not the security team, right? You've got executives in from all parts of the business. And what you're saying is exactly what I stress to them, is that every single one of them is responsible, right? And things that I say that like, hey, everyone can leave here with, for example, is what are the top 3 applications that you've got within your specific team that are hosting data that's most sensitive? So start looking at what would be the worst case data that could get stolen from this organization. Where is it housed? And then what part of ownership does my team have over that? And then really looking at understanding, how would I get access to it? How can I protect and enable further protection of access to it? And then ultimately, how would I communicate with other parts of the division and other parts of the organization if some of that data were lost? And those are the types of things we really start trying to get people to think about, and realizing that cybersecurity used to be this weird, obscure, war games kind of thing. And like, oh, I don't get it. People would say, I'm not technical. The reality is you really don't need to be, right? This is everyone's problem. It's all about the data and the information. And if we understand how all of that can be accessed and how it works together, we're going to be so much better off for protecting it.
I love that. I love to hear that you all are approaching those kinds of situations. You're helping to coach all these teams. And talking about that, and it's really sort of the democratization, or the sort of getting, I like to call it sort of enlisting your whole company as the National Guard, right? Like you sort of have your full-time, sort of military or special forces or whatever you call this, the full-time security team, but then everyone else is kind of, needs to be part of it. We did have a question that I think relates to what you just said. So I'll see if there's anything that you'd want to add, but basically there's a lot of proliferation of apps, and it's really hard to have complete control over what's going on. And you might have, dozens of SaaS apps. You might have 3 or 4 different clouds that you're deploying things on, whatever, right? There's a proliferation problem. So, I do think you just kind of addressed this in your previous comments, but like, what do you, when you talk to a company, maybe at those executive offsites, and there are 100 different apps that they're concerned with, how do you help them whittle it down? Do you try to do really the sort of democratization, and you're responsible for this set, you're responsible for this set? Like, how do you all think about that, or how do you see it playing out in your clients?
So I think there's kind of 2 different conversations, right? One is just the actual like technical conversation of the complexity of having all these apps that are hosting your data. But I think, to me, it kind of gets to the reality of the fact that a lot of times, I think what we're hinting at is there's this underlying tension, right, between the security team and then all these other divisions of the company. And that's because oftentimes they see security as being inhibitors to getting work done. So business leaders like to have their own apps for their own teams. They like to have their own different types of data capabilities so they can get work done faster, right? That's usually the impetus for that, whether they're metric they can make more money by getting work done faster, or their employees are metriced by some other mechanism. I think everyone usually has good intent. So the more that the data owners, so the business leaders, can have a stronger relationship with the security teams, they can work together on a strategy of applications, right? And we see that at IBM, for example. One of the big challenges we have is it's so huge that, our team might need a threat intelligence tool, but there may be a product team that also needs a threat intelligence, that same tool. And there may be the cloud hosting environment that needs it as well. And the internal security team can actually be an enabler for shared services, shared costs, which really improves the investment from everyone's perspective, as well as the performance, if we can drive those conversations. And I see those same challenges not only, play out for us, but they play out for our clients at a large scale. So I think, that there's 2 ways to solve it, but I don't think just the technology and the pure kind of technical components of it are really the way to solve it. I think it's also about increasing this human interaction between the organization to allow us to have those effective conversations about it.
Yeah. I'm glad you sort of ended with that, because one of my pet peeves is that there's such a focus on sort of technical indicators or threat intelligence. And I love that stuff, by the way, don't get me wrong. And I know you all do a lot in sort of threat intel, and we all need IOCs and hashes and IP addresses. I mean, that increases all of our ability to look for the bad stuff, or the malicious activity. But I feel like there's often so much optimization that can be done in terms of how security teams function, the people, the process, and then the tech, right? Or the whole business as a whole, how it thinks about security. So, maybe like we've talked a little bit about the business, the executives, the sort of data owners, and that kind of thing. But if you look at a security team, maybe more, at the security team itself, and you ignore maybe the tech for a second, do you have any sort of recommendations, especially as we're looking forward to coming out of this and we all need to communicate from home or whatever it ends up being? How do you think teams can improve, just, on the more of the people and the process side versus the technical side?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a little tough to answer, right? It can be kind of broad, but I think that there's actually some real benefits that have come out of being in quarantine, right? And that everyone now has this shared experience that we've gone through together, despite that we're apart. And ultimately, I know for us, it's brought some people closer together, right? I've now not having to spend kind of 2 days a week, for example, on an airplane, right? Flying cross country or flying internationally. I have more time to be talking to the team members, to be more engaged with the details a few levels down that maybe I didn't have the time to do before because I was losing that much time, you know, running to the airplane, packing, going through security at the airport, right? Those types of things. So I think that in a wide variety of ways, there's a lot of benefits to that. The other thing that I would say would be, we get a question pretty often about what should I be doing right now? You know, technology aside, what can we be doing with our teams? And I think one of the biggest things is actually practicing your response plan. And you don't need to hire an external firm to do all that for you, right? You can, and there are many of us that would be more than happy to do that. But you can really look at like common fundamental questions, like, can I get a hold of my team members if I can't send them an email, right? If our email infrastructure is down, if my primary communication mechanisms are down, how am I going to get a hold of my most critical people on the team? Do I know where they're at? Do I have secondary or tertiary measures in place? Do I understand how to get access to data? And then how does that shift? You know, one of the things we've got a lot of questions on is, okay, we can't really do, you know, a lot of times you might, in an investigation, for example, you might want to do live response against a wide variety of hosts, and then you start drilling down right into the systems that you really are interested in looking at. Well, maybe if that system is in a remote location where we don't actually physically have somebody in there who can go take an image and it's not safe and they don't have personal protective gear, then we've got to have a plan B. And so there's been a lot of conversations and a lot of opportunity we've had to work with clients to really look at like, okay, we can access these subsets of data. Right now, that's the best we have. And so really coming up with a strategy for how we're going to do an investigation and then how we're going to limit risk based on the decisions of the data that we do have, right? That's everything at the end of the day, I think, comes down to this risk-based decision. How much risk are we willing to take? How much potential data loss are we willing to allow to occur? And then we make all the decisions based off of that. And so now we're making those just with the realization that, okay, for this period in time, we can't get access to certain types of data. And so we've got to have some fundamental workarounds that we're ready to go. So those are the types of conversations that I think every organization can and should be having in advance, as proactively and as often as possible, right? So that you can really look to understand how you can quickly defend.
Yeah, no, I really like that, you know, sort of the practicing the response. And if email or Teams or Slack or pick your communication mechanism, if that goes down, how do you keep going? How do you defend? How do you respond? Yeah, no, that's really cool. Okay, well, quick time check. I think we have about 10 minutes. I know I could keep going all day, but you're having to do most of the talking, so we'll give you a break in a few minutes and start to wrap this up. But, you know, as teams start to look forward, and I don't know if you're involved in these conversations or your team is or not, but are you getting questions from your clients around what should they be investing in from a cybersecurity perspective, or like where should they start to kind of place their new bets, or if their budget's open again, like what should they be doing? Like are you in those kinds of conversations, or how's that going?
No, I think a lot of the questions tend to be more related to like what should we be doing right now versus necessarily where we need to be focused moving forward. Because I think a lot of the strategic budgets, you know, haven't necessarily shifted as much, but from a tactical sense, people are really concerned about that. So it's, I'll probably sound like a broken record, right? But some of the things that I think are the most critical, one would be first and foremost, testing your incident response plan. Second, making sure that you've got multi-factor authentication to as many of your remote devices as possible, ideally 100%. And then third would really be looking at like, where is our most sensitive data? What could we not operate with? If it's, you know, if this data was stolen, what would be detrimental to operations? And then really looking to have a strategy in place to have that data available and backed up offline, right? So not just backed up and connected to the network at all times, but backed up and some of it offline. And it's certainly not feasible to have all of your data backed up offline. That's not cost effective, but having a subset that really is the most critical it is absolutely needed. And so I think really looking at just how we prioritize our actions, right? This is something that my boss is very kind of relentless on, is what are you doing today and how is it contributing to our overall goals, right? We can all say, and I think certainly in the pandemic times, we've kind of felt overwhelmed and busy and there's so much going on, and how is it that we feel like we're working harder now when we're working from home? But the reality is we could kind of all let our days be consumed with things that are maybe not as important or not getting us to kind of the end goal. And so really having a pretty relentless focus on that is something that I think all the three actions I mentioned, those kind of relate to that in a security sense.
Yeah. Yeah, another book shout out, Essentialism, my favorite book, focus on the vital few versus the trivial many. And I think it's, for all of us, it's extremely easy to knock off 1,000 little things, but not really focus on our big sort of purpose or what moves the needle, or pick your, pick your sort of analogy or whatever. But I think in security, there's a lot around, oh, I can just like, resolve alerts all day long, or I can just, whatever, like do something that's very fast and you get that instant gratification, but doesn't necessarily make you stronger or, more mature from a security perspective. I know we're running out of time. I think we already hit a couple of the questions. If anyone has questions, please put them in the comments here before we finish up. But as we start to wrap up here, if you were jumping into an organization now, and maybe this is a little bit of repetitiveness because you've given a lot of tips already, but if you're jumping into an organization now, like you joined as the CISO or some senior security role, maybe kind of what would you focus on over the next, few months or something like that?
Well, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention endpoint visibility, right? Again, so really first and foremost, what data is occurring or what actions, are occurring on my endpoints. And then where's my most sensitive data, who's accessing it, and really kind of looking at those first and foremost. And then I think there's a number of other things that are also extremely high priority. But for me, I'd be kind of wanting to figure out where are our blind spots and how can we limit those as much as possible.
That's great. Yeah. So before we start to wrap up here, you guys have a, well, I'll let you speak because I'm going to mess it up. But you do a bunch with threat intel, and I think you have some stuff you wanted to mention. So I'll just turn it over to you for your threat intelligence community or however you refer to it.
Yeah, so we've got an enclave online, which is ultimately threat intelligence information shared specifically about COVID-19. So we've got a large number of multinational organizations, government agencies that are participating, and everyone is sharing information with the intent of this is related to these type of most recent threats. So if organizations are interested in joining, we have a free 90-day license, and they can find more about that either by going to IBM.com and drilling down in the cybersecurity, or going to IBM.com cyber and looking specifically for the security components of that, of our offerings, and then it's the Iris and TrueStar Enclave specific.
Great. Well, I think we're starting to wrap up here. Like I said, I could go all day, but I've had the easy job here. Wendy's had to, you've had to answer all the questions and give us all the advice. But yeah, I mean, I just want to comment on the blind spot stuff. What we find a lot is we connect to companies, Office 365, Zoom, Slack, a bunch of different applications. Workday soon here, stuff like that. And, the security teams just weren't really in the light, or they didn't really have good visibility into a lot of these tools, right? And so that does tend to be sort of eye-opening when you can start to see what's actually going on, or to Wendy's earlier points, how many of your users, maybe even just your admins, don't have MFA turned on, or where are people logging in that bypasses SSO or some of these other things. So it is quite interesting to start looking at these different applications that maybe a lot of people in the security community grew up network monitoring or endpoint, and they haven't really thought too much about, sort of cloud monitoring or kind of continuous visibility. So I just want to call out that whether it's with us or somebody else, like, take a look at your your activity in some of these apps, because we do see a lot going on. So, Wendy, before we go, any parting thoughts or anything to add?
Hey, I just really enjoyed getting to chat with you today. I appreciate the invite and looking forward to actually, seeing you again in person at some point and getting to enjoy either some surfing or some drinks or some more cyber talks.
Yeah, usually a combination of all the above, I think. But probably surfing before the margaritas, or it's going to go even worse than I typically do. So
for me as well.
But it's getting warmer water out there, and if anyone's in SoCal and we can start to be nearer each other, we'd love to create like a SoCal Cyber Surf Club or something. I'm just throwing out terms there, but I try to go out every weekend, so that'd be fun. Yeah, well, thanks a lot. I'll turn it back over to Suda to close us out. But Wendy, this was awesome. I really appreciate it, and look forward to catching up as well.
Thanks, Ben. You too.
Awesome. Ben, Wendy, that was a super interesting, broad-ranging conversation. I did not expect that the conversation would be so broad that it took us to bloody lions and crazy shoes. Thank you for taking the time. This was fantastic. We will be sending out notes to everyone who attended after this session. I've got copious notes and look forward to seeing you again on the video channel here, Wendy. This was a fantastic session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sita.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.